This wasn't random. This was never an accident. Not the timing, not the place, not the way it unfolded. If it feels random, that's because the structure stayed invisible long enough. By the end of this, nothing will be solved, nothing will be fixed. What will change is the way you see repetition. And once repetition becomes visible, it stops pretending to be coincidence. Most people experience events as isolated moments: a conversation, a conflict, an ending, a beginning. They appear separate, self-contained, detached from everything else. But the mind does not experience life in fragments. It experiences patterns. Patterns are not dramatic. They are quiet sequences, emotional rhythms that repeat under different names. The faces change, the environments shift, the details rearrange themselves, but the internal structure remains. The brain does not prioritize novelty the way you think it does. It prioritizes familiarity. It searches for what it recognizes. It anticipates what it has already survived, and what it has survived becomes normal. This is how something can happen again without feeling deliberate. The external event looks new. Internally, it feels known, and familiarity lowers resistance. Resistance is not moral, it is biological. The nervous system resists what feels unpredictable. It relaxes into what feels rehearsed, even if what feels rehearsed once caused pain. Repetition is not always conscious. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with intention. It emerges from internal organization. Your internal organization was shaped long before this moment. Experiences accumulate, not just as memories, but as calibrations. Each event subtly adjusts what feels tolerable, what feels acceptable, what feels expected. Over time, expectations become invisible baselines. You stop measuring them. You stop questioning them. They operate quietly, guiding perception without commentary. When something happens that aligns with that baseline, it does not trigger alarm. It feels consistent. Consistency is mistaken for inevitability. This is where the idea of accident becomes fragile. An accident suggests disruption, a break in continuity, a sudden divergence from the path. But structural repetition is continuity. It is alignment with a pre-existing internal configuration. Think about how quickly certain situations feel familiar: the tone of a voice, the emotional distance in a room, the subtle tension beneath a conversation, the way someone withdraws, the way someone approaches. These cues register faster than thought. Before language forms, the body recognizes the pattern. Recognition, at the bodily level, is not dramatic. It is subtle. A slight tightening, a small shift in breathing, a sense that you have been here before. That sensation is not mystical. It is structural memory. Structural memory is not about recalling specific events. It is about recalling emotional architecture, the shape of an interaction, the rhythm of a dynamic. And once the architecture matches, the system relaxes into it. Relaxation does not mean comfort. It means predictability. Predictability reduces cognitive load. The brain does not need to compute new outcomes. It runs an existing script. Scripts operate quietly. They do not ask permission. This is why certain outcomes feel both surprising and strangely unsurprising. On the surface, you did not expect it. The recognition was there before the event concluded. Most explanations focus on decision-making, on choices, on visible actions, but structural patterns form beneath conscious choice. They form in response to repeated conditions, repeated tones, repeated emotional climates. If certain dynamics were consistent in earlier experiences, the nervous system learned to navigate them. Navigation becomes competence. Competence becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes attraction. Not attraction in the romantic sense. Attraction as orientation. You orient toward what you know how to handle. This orientation is not deliberate. It does not feel like preference. It feels like gravity. Gravity does not announce itself. It does not explain itself. It simply pulls. When a situation resembles earlier emotional structures, it carries a gravitational pull. You may interpret it as chemistry, as fate, as coincidence. But the pull is structural alignment. Here is the subtle part. The nervous system values coherence over novelty. Coherence means the internal story matches the external event, even if the story is limiting. When an event confirms an internal narrative, it feels stabilizing, not pleasant, stabilizing. If the internal narrative says relationships end abruptly, an abrupt ending feels coherent. If the narrative says effort is rarely reciprocated, lack of reciprocity feels coherent. Coherence reduces dissonance. Dissonance requires reevaluation. Reevaluation requires energy. The brain conserves energy, so it allows coherence to continue. This is why repetition can feel inevitable. Now pause here. Notice how the word accident begins to lose its clarity. An accident implies randomness, but structural repetition is not random. It is patterned alignment between internal expectation and external environment. You did not consciously design the repetition, but the repetition aligns with internal calibrations. Calibrations are not visible. They operate beneath awareness. They influence perception before interpretation. If someone speaks with a tone that resembles a tone you have adapted to before, your body responds instantly. You may not label it, but the orientation has already shifted. The shift guides behavior subtly. Slight changes in posture, slight changes in tone, slight concessions. These micro-adjustments reinforce the pattern. Reinforcement does not require intention. It requires participation. Participation often happens automatically. At this point, the pattern does not need effort. It sustains itself. When the outcome eventually mirrors previous outcomes, the mind searches for a narrative. It says this was unexpected. It says this was unfortunate. But beneath the narrative, the structure was already active. Recognition begins quietly. You start noticing echoes, similar phrases, similar emotional conclusions, similar distances. The differences between events shrink. The similarities grow. That is the moment where accident becomes questionable. Structure does not accuse. It explains. Once explanation begins, the randomness fades. This is the pattern reveal. The repetition did not begin when the event happened. It began long before. It existed as internal configuration. The event simply activated it. Activation feels external. Configuration is internal. You cannot see configuration directly, you see its consequences. Consequences repeat because configurations persist. This is where identity quietly enters the picture. When patterns persist long enough, they integrate into self-concept. They become part of how you describe yourself. Independent, guarded, overgiving, detached, persistent, unlucky. These labels feel descriptive. They are often structural summaries. When identity aligns with pattern, repetition feels personal, not accidental. Personal does not mean intentional. It means integrated. If a pattern has become integrated, it shapes perception. Perception shapes selection. Selection shapes outcome. The loop closes quietly. This loop is rarely visible from the inside. It feels like life happening to you. But when repetition becomes undeniable, something shifts. You begin to see that the same emotional geometry keeps reappearing. The geometry is subtle. It is not about identical events. It is about identical shapes. A familiar beginning, a familiar tension, a familiar distance. The shape matters more than the details. This is the recognition moment. Not loud, not dramatic, clear. Clear enough to disrupt the illusion of randomness. When randomness dissolves, attention turns inward. Not toward blame, toward structure. You start asking not why this happened, but why this pattern feels known. The answer is rarely in the present event alone. It is in accumulated calibration, in rehearsed navigation, in internal coherence. You did not consciously choose repetition, but repetition aligns with internal familiarity. Familiarity feels safe even when it is limiting. Safety is persuasive. Once you see this, the narrative shifts again. The event is no longer an isolated incident. It becomes part of a visible sequence. Sequences can be observed. Observation does not immediately change them, but it alters the way they are experienced. The next time a familiar geometry begins forming, recognition arrives sooner. Not as alarm, as awareness. Awareness creates a small space between configuration and activation. That space is subtle, but it exists. And once a space exists, the structure is no longer invisible. This was never an accident. It was alignment. There is another layer beneath this one, and it has been operating longer than...
I'm Oliver, and now you know why this happens. Or at least a part of it.